Anyways, welcome everyone. Nice to have you here. Good to have everyone online as well. And usually when we start our Kubernetes meetup, nice to see you all. Welcome. We guys like to kind of see what jobs are out there, who's looking, who's giving out jobs. I don't know if anyone's giving them out anymore, but who's looking, or if there's any fun things that you've learned that the community could want to learn. So anything that anybody wants to say, or who's selling a bike? No, I'm just saying anything that's well, tonight's kind of an interesting night. The last time we met, there was a discussion that the regulars, we probably take it for granted that Kubernetes may be a little bit new for some people, or the nuances are not as known because they haven't been in that space as long. And so the thought was that we're going to do an interactive workshop. Okay. What we're going to talk about today is what's kind of are some of the best practices for developers in using a local Kubernetes environment. First of all, the question is when would you do it? Why would you do it? And then we're going to talk about the how. Okay. So to start out, I'm going to just open it up, but why would you want a local Kubernetes cluster? Why would you want one? Carson.
Personally, I need it when I'm developing operators.
Yeah.
That's really a niche use case. I get it.
I agree.
But it's almost
You
mandatory.
have to. I agree with you. I've done that, and that's when you definitely need it.
Yep.
Operators, does that make a sense? Operators are a control plane for whatever you want.
When you're working with something that needs to use the API and you don't want to use somebody's real API.
So, okay, who else? Or if they aren't using it, or why would you think you would want to have a local cluster? What are some of the reasons that people have? Please.
Yeah, maybe if your production runs through Kubernetes, it might be good for free locally as well.
To do what now?
If your production's Kubernetes, it might be easy.
Yeah. Okay. So the notion of if the corporation, company, whatever is using Kubernetes, it's nice to have one in your own, kind of to play around with, because most likely you're not going to have the permissions that you would like to have in the production world, even if it were in dev, hopefully. But specifically, if you're using the API, you're definitely not going to have the rights that you need most often. So, okay, anybody else? Where the question was, why would you ever want to have a local Kubernetes cluster? We had Carson saying, well, using the API, developing to it like operators. The other one is kind of duplicate, kind of mirror what's in production, because I have more rights to be able to do stuff in it that I might have someone. Please.
It's the stupid simple one is to learn it. Like to be able to actually figure out how things plug together.
Yeah. And that is a really interesting point, because learning Kubernetes is like saying, I don't know, what's the analogy? I know programming languages. You know, maybe not that broad, but it's an ecosystem.
Learning AWS or
Yeah, yes, it is. It truly is. And in fact, it's actually even more so. Well, it depends on the level you're at, but it is like having your own cloud infrastructure, knowing all the nuances in that. If you're really at somewhat of a, not just deploy something and let it be, if you're really wanting to understand Kubernetes and all the aspects, because you're either consulting or you're helping set it up or you're helping influencing the powers that be within your company, you actually have to have that better knowledge. And there's no better way to do that than to have a local environment. Anybody else have some other ideas of why you'd want to have a local? Okay. Why not Docker Compose? Come on. The beauty of Docker Compose.
Don't run it in production.
Okay, don't run in production. Okay, so that's let me back up. So I think that's an interesting point. So the nuance is One, that you have a production environment in which Kubernetes is already there, or that you're trying to get that into production and influencing it to be there. Because in the old days, I have VMware or Parallel or whatever, and I could grab a VM and do my development in there, and things are great. The only thing that got bad with VMware or Parallels or having the virtual machine world is that you can't scale it on local machines usually. And even, I wouldn't even say local machines, but in general, because truly you're needing the whole OS virtualized rather than just the APIs of an OS to run an image, a container. And so in reality, people, when they say, hey, I can just do it through a virtual machine, blah, blah, blah. Well, I keep on saying, well, sure, but you are going to get to a limit far faster than you would in a Kubernetes world. Now let's talk about Docker Compose, because Docker Compose still is running images, containers locally, again, not using or not needing a full-fledged virtual environment for an OS. Why not Docker Compose? I saw that. Okay, I saw the little.
I have no problem with it. You end up writing it twice, right? You are doing a parallel track. It's often, I'm not surprised when I see it as like, here's a Docker Compose file we use to run local development, and it's a totally different thing when it goes to Kubernetes.
So
That's fine, honestly. It works.
my experience with Docker Compose, sorry, I'm not paying any attention to your talk, is that if you're not,
Well, okay, Mariah, that's fine.
I apologize, I'm jumping
least
in.
She's very honest. That's very good.
So if you're not running 3 or more services in Docker Compose, I find it easier to just run it with the Docker command. So just do a Docker run at whatever that container is for local development. I know people like their scripts and like single setup, but it's like with whatever I run, I think if I'm only connecting 1 or 2 things, I don't know. I feel like I feel like it's a weird, I feel like local development's weird already.
Yep.
And so I want to keep it as streamlined as possible and not, I don't know, like I feel like having a whole bunch of infrastructure for local development is harder and makes me go slower. That's why I don't like Docker Compose. I would rather just run Docker, 2 extra Docker commands and 2 tabs and be good. Right.
Let's get
That's
back
my
to that.
comment. Sorry. Go ahead.
No, that was a perfect answer for the question that we had, which was, for those that came in, was why would I want to have a local Kubernetes environment? And we were just talking about why not Docker Compose. Doran.
Yeah, so the one thing that pops into my head is if you have a production environment that relies on things like sidecars, there's really no way to test that locally in just like a Docker or Docker Compose ecosystem. You need Kubernetes to provide that sidecar model.
Thank you for bringing that up, Doran, because I think that's an interesting point, is that if again, the premise is I want to develop in an environment that is as close to, if not, well, I can't say exact, but close to production, you will run into these situations where sidecar or maybe some other
Volume.
operator that's in the corporation's world,
Ingress is
the
different.
ingress, so in that regard, you will get better commonality if you are using a local. There's a hand here.
Yeah, why not use something like telepresence to proxy your local running container into production?
All right, so telepresence or anything like that, why don't we just use that? Because why would I want to have a cloud on my laptop? Why do I have to have 64 gig if I want, whatever? Can I put everything up on my laptop?
Prevent that, right?
Huh?
No rest would prevent that.
Yeah.
That's your, right, you
Run a local instance, a local like Docker run service, no Kubernetes required, no Docker Compose required, and then you just proxy that pod into your cluster.
I understand, and in fact, Solo was an early one that did that. Telepresence, and there's others that do that. Very good way of doing it, but the premise was, and maybe that's a good way of saying, kind of when I wouldn't use a local one is that when I do have the ability to have an environment such that telepresence is available, meaning the corporation has a developer, a dev cluster, right? And that I can mess up that dev cluster without messing up everybody else's environment. Because that's possible, right? Depending upon if I'm doing operators or I'm doing some more.
Scales really well. It's fine at small scale, right? But it does have a lot of nuance around like, well, who's currently the one intercepting and taking over this deployment,
Correct.
that place? Like it's not a.
It's not a
There's
isolated environment.
no.
You could use something like Garden to spin up clusters, like dev clusters in the cloud, and then use telepresence to connect into.
Yes, absolutely. And that's kind of one of the things that we're going to talk about, like what are some of the options and where's the nuance of when you'd want to use one versus another. So I'm glad you brought that up. So I think the key here is if you have a dev cluster or something of that sort, and you really do want an environment that's like exact, meaning we hope the dev and the prod are pretty exact, right? That telepresence or those type of tools are very good. But I think that nuance of where you drop down is when that environment is such that you need it to be a little bit more customized because you're doing some things that you want to control more. That's when maybe the notion of having a local cluster is useful. All right,
I have another comment.
please.
I know somebody who wanted to be able to develop completely offline. I think if your goal is to never have to connect to the internet, you would want to replicate your production locally as good as possible.
I've been on planes or
Exactly.
like a hotel or whatever, and
That's not my
I
goal.
like having a cluster.
If that was, but yeah, I'm saying if you deploy to Kubernetes and you were trying to code offline, completely disconnected, yeah, you'd totally want to replicate it.
You have a really heck of a time doing an air gapped. I mean, maybe some of these tools are better, right? A lot of them are really.
I mean, like I said, I would never try to do it.
No,
But
I'm not saying you can't, but like even like well, I guess we're getting development tools. I'm trying to think like a lot of the ones are even Kubernetes itself is going to assume some level of internet accessibility.
Yeah,
It's not impossible. It's just
it certainly can do it, but again, the context or the constraints are such you have to know them in order to make it a worthwhile thing. So, okay, our first comment was, okay, why would we ever want one? And we're talking then about Docker Compose or VMs and all that stuff. So that's kind of where we are. And the Docker Compose thing, I think, is still valid because with Docker Compose, let's say I have a database and I want a database and I don't want to manage like the disk space or all that stuff. It may be easier in Compose because I don't need to, get a PV, which is a persistent volume C claim, or I don't have to do those type of things.
connectivity. The thing you'll consistently find with any of the tools for local development in Kubernetes is, all right, it's one thing to run, like it's actually pretty trivial to like spin up a local cluster and run a database in it to a point.
Yeah.
But then like you connecting your local code to that or you running your code in that cluster is non-trivial. And the loop of like Docker Compose gives you this nice thing of like, yeah, I'm just running it. It's listing, it's binding to local.
Yeah.
Like to this.
It bridges that
It's no big
local
deal.
environment pretty well.
Once you start to try to develop actively in Kubernetes, it's like, well, every time I want to run a new version of my code, I'll just build an image and stick it in the pod. Like that sucks.
Yeah.
It's a really painful experience.
Now, we've had presentations in the past, general containers. We've actually had what's the virtual vCluster where you build they allow you to do a cluster within a cluster. There's a lot of different things that are available out there if you don't want to have it locally. But let's make this assumption that, okay, Paul, I feel like I need a local cluster. Either I don't know Kubernetes well enough and I want to really understand it, or I really have the constraints in which I need a really isolated environment, specialized environment, and also maybe I want to have sidecars or other things that are kind of more mimicking
Brand new version and you want to test it.
Yeah.
Like you may have access to 6 clusters, but you can't just upgrade them to the new hotness.
That's right. That's right. All right. So let's then go to What are the options? Oh, please.
Sorry, it kind of goes back a little bit, but like, are there cases where you shouldn't want to have a local cluster? Or
Well, I
like,
think those are the anti reasons
Yeah.
why you'd want one, meaning I have too many dependencies. I have, well, for instance, here at we 500,
More than that now, yeah, so.
maybe 600,
Yeah.
600
Versus.
services, let alone how many things are within inside all of those services. Like there's a control, the operator for certain stuff, and there's a sidecar for certain stuff, and then there's all these other things. So I think where it gets to the point where your dependency tree is so big that again, it's coming down to this, why do I need, 500 gigabytes of memory? That's not reasonable. Companies barely give you more than 16 gig, right? So I think that would be where I'd say,
are there other reasons though, or like the primary?
well, I think what Mariah was saying kind of here is that if I just want to spin up a database and then, do a little web service to it, blah, 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 maybe it'd be easier. I would contend that the notion of writing a Docker Compose file and the notion of creating the objects that you would need in Kubernetes is, for me at least, it's a wash.
I'm a big believer in once you've got enough, it's enough. Like if you can write a Docker Compose file and that is enough to like develop your service and test the thing you need to test, like
Why not?
why would you go further? It's solving the problem is solved. Like, yeah, you're like, yeah, we're going to deploy this to Kubernetes. That's the point, right?
Well, and I like what Carson's saying. He's very much an advocate of this. Is this notion of just do enough, to meet the need that you need. That need could be such that I want to learn, or I want to get involved, or I want to do some deeper, versioning or API or whatever. Those could be the reasons, but I really like that notion of just enough. And if Docker Compose is just enough to get me where I need, then that's where I'd say, why? Why would I do the Kubernetes? Please.
If you have a service or a bunch of services that need to interact with each other for like testing, then maybe you have an issue like with your contracts service to service. If you have to develop locally in a Kubernetes cluster, then maybe your services are too tightly coupled, and maybe you need to figure out how you're composing your.
I think that's a very interesting comment because if we really as developers take that approach, what if we said, if every company that said, no, you have to develop on a local cluster. You have to before you go into the production. Would that change our architecture or how we would build these interconnecting services, and or how would we test them? Do I really need to stand up the whole thing if I'm only wanting to get a query and get a response back? Well, am I mocking? Am I faking? Am I, whatever you want to call the things? Is that a better approach? Because wait a second, maybe I'll have a better service if I take that premise from the beginning. But very interesting. Nice thought there. All right. What are the options, Todd? What are the options?
Anycube, K3D, K3S, Kai.
Okay, very good. So I don't think you did it in order. If you had, you could do a $50 Amazon. No.
I'd have contributed.
But
Your desktop just uses K3S under the hood. I don't
it
think.
does. Well, the reason why I put it here is there has been a heritage of Rancher that actually had a bunch of tools that are not there anymore. But the reason I put this here is because it really does bring up an environment for the type of individual that doesn't want to have too much low level junk.
But they also have enterprise support.
And they have that too.
Yeah.
Because I get a GUI, I'm gonna get GUIs on this one is not really a cluster, local cluster thing. It is to be able to use a local cluster to do nice, repetitive, iterative development.
Not how you run the cluster, but it's how you would use a local.
Interact with it.
Like,
Yeah.
Okay.
And Garden is kind of the hybrid too, kind of between those two. Definitely, let's say Minikube, K3S, K3D. And I didn't have on here, which I was going to add interactively, but I'm not going to. Micro K8S, which is another one that Ubuntu has.
They added that.
Which you should also avoid.
Wow. So
How were they solving
there, I mean, if we want some opinions straight up, this is the man you want to talk to right away.
If you want the pain without like the proprietary mess, just use Minikube.
Yeah,
I agree. All right. So let's just talk a little bit about where these things came from. Okay. When you look at Minikube, let's take it from the bottom up. That is used inside of, well, I don't know if this is true. It used to be such that Kubernetes as a project used this.
I think it was the OG, yeah.
Like the only way you could do, like, if you're like, I want to work on the API server.
Yeah.
Like they're like, run Minikube and run your API server code.
This was the way to do it. So if you're right at the lowest level, this is probably a good place to be. Right?
I think it was the original. So like
Yeah.
it started the trend and has still persisted because at the end of the day, your goal is an API server and some other moving parts. Like defining how much of the server you want is a pretty big part of your goal as well. Like half of these are like K3S is a stripped down version of Kubernetes, which provides most of what you actually care about and none of the implementation details. Whereas Minikube was more like, actually, we're trying to do the implementation details. So that's why
Exactly.
it's that.
100%. Yeah.
This is as certified environment as you can get. So therefore you can test against it, develop against it, and know that across the board, whether I'm in AKS land or GKE or whatever, I'm going to work because I'm working with the certified version.
I would maybe disagree with that. And I would say, you make it sound like it's the one you should choose.
No,
And I would,
I'm not saying it totally.
okay.
Because that's where it came from. That's where it is. I think what I would say today is each of these other ones have become certified, right? Like K3S. Okay, give the nuance for those that don't know the difference between these two. Person?
Right. So K3S, like micro-K8s, but I forget it exists, is a single binary. It's one package and it's all of the upstream. It's like the actual upstream Kubernetes code.
Yep.
Right, so take the code that runs the API server and the controller and the scheduler and all the pieces that all these separate Go packages that are normally separate processes, and they pull it over into one code base and just have it spin off all the pieces in one. So you can understand it sits there and runs. It's running the entire. Again, almost everything you would get from the full Minikube, except for it's in one process. So you can't test like failover from multiple controllers. You can't test multiple API servers because it's one process that's doing all of the things.
But in that same vein, I could have multiple nodes.
Still
I
doing
could have as many, things that are giving me that environment. But you're right in the sense of
yeah, that K3, and but the thing is, it's a process. So it's a little clunky to work with to start them and stop them because you have to like send a process to the background or run it in a terminal somewhere. So K3D said, we're really good. We have a tool that's really good at running processes in the background. It's called Docker. So that's what that does.
okay. Well, that's what I'm doing here.
You sit here unlocking constantly.
So thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Sorry, I've been trying to do that, but I forget when I'm talking, and so I shouldn't say this, but I'll skip it out of that. Anyways, I do open it up.
K3S is a Kubernetes and all-in-one. K3D is a nice way to run K3S servers using Docker.
So where we have come from at this point is this. We talked about why would you ever want a local environment? Some of the reasons why would I use Docker Compose, Docker itself, some of the areas you might consider kind of where you would want to say, okay, I want it because I'm learning it, or I have a need at the very low level, like creating operators, whatever. But it came down to the point, beware of not just jumping into having a local environment. Understand why you need that local environment. And then we're talking about some of the how to have this. And this is interesting as you bring up here. Let's just talk very briefly again. I don't have the diagram, but for those that are maybe more new to the Kubernetes environment, there are a couple of things that are pretty important that are essential to understand, and why Carson's nuance of how wonderful this being a single binary it is. So Kubernetes has what's considered a control plane. And the crown jewels of that control plane is also a storage of all of the resources and everything that make up that system. Okay, so traditional world, you have etcd. etcd was this, I came out of CoreOS, and it became this store for these elements that Kubernetes needs. So you needed this cluster, very resilient cluster for storing the state of things. You then, of course, in Kubernetes land, you have this control plane in which you have a main node and then secondary nodes, is what we call them today. And the main nodes would have like schedulers and controller stuff and other things that the API server. And then you have these other secondary nodes, which we would consider just calling them nodes. That's where the processes such as pods run on. Okay. And what's nice about this one specifically is I think they actually use SQLite.
They
Right?
use what's called Kine, K-I-N-E.
That's
That
right.
is a shim layer that lets
You
SQL,
can go-
Postgres,
That's right. You can plug them in.
Nats.
Yep, that's right.
Nats. Essentially, yeah, I'm not even kidding. It basically is like, yeah, here's an API that is etcd, but behind that we shim in
Anything you want.
4 or 5 different kinds of database, depending what you need.
Now, just
You use SQLite.
yeah, and that's what's nice, that I don't have to have anything but a binary, even though underneath they're doing some stuff. All right, let's go then the nuance of this one. This is because Carson has a Linux box.
Oh, yeah.
This is because I have a Mac box.
Fair enough.
Right?
That's okay.
Because this is K3S in Docker. Whereas this one, I think, like if I'm using Ubuntu or whatever, is it using KVM underneath, or what's it using?
The K3S is just it's the entire control plane in a single binary.
It's just a binary itself.
And you can download an x86 version of it, you can download an
Yeah.
ARM version of it,
So
you can download.
It truly is a binary process that runs the whole
I
thing.
can't remember what it does for the actual containers. Does it talk to the Docker socket?
Yes.
Container
No,
D?
no, there's no
K3S
Docker.
you can run in system D. It doesn't.
Yeah.
require-
We actually tell the API to launch containers. What's it launching them using?
It says a process.
So it still is trying to talk to something that's a run C provider. It doesn't replace that.
Okay.
You still
So
need that.
that's his main problem on Mac, is he doesn't have a run C provider on Mac.
That's correct.
So for me, I
That's
can
a
do
little
it.
low level, but you need something to run these images, right? And that's either run C.
Maybe, I mean, if all you need is a control plane and you're never launching a container,
That's true.
you don't.
That's what they're developing.
You might just be testing webhooks or something that's part of the control plane.
So typically you'll hear these in conjunction, these, any others that we'd say would be spun up. I said micro KDS, which is proprietary.
There's a weird one that's more for performance and load testing, like when you're testing the actual control plane or something that needs to do like heavy scale, and all you care about is like, I'm going to have thousands of these CRDs and I want to see what happens. I'm not actually trying to test the performance. The Kubernetes without kubelet is an interesting one where it tries to do the control plane, but with none of the implementation. It's just like expressly trying to do very certain parts of it. And when you're building a controller and you're like, well, what would happen if I had 1,000 of this CRD? It's a very easy way to do that.
You know what it is?
It's Kubernetes without kubelet. So KWK, I think, KWalk.
I was gonna say, especially for anyone who's kind of introductory to Kubernetes here, a lot of people's first introduction is going to be with like Docker Desktop or Warp Stack in the
And,
that are in
and
that.
that's why that's there too, right? Rancher's the same thing.
Do not use Docker Desktop.
Yeah, use Warp Stack.
Use Rancher Desktop or something.
What's the word you said?
Warp Stack.
It's a paid,
It's pretty.
Oh, it's for Mac, no wonder. Okay.
and it's a paid thing.
It's
It's like
really,
honorware.
yeah, it's like honorware. It's got a really good free tier,
It does, but
but never paid for it.
But if you're if you're individual and indie, you're fine. If you're corporation, that's when you have that notion of, or maybe a little bit more. Whereas Rancher truly is open to no matter what, although you can get enterprise support. Okay, these other ones, the Tilt, the Garden in itself, and Kind, although this one is relatively similar. This is Kubernetes and Docker as well. But also has some other nuances, to it. Let's open it up to, let's see, Todd, did you have something that you wanted to talk about? Or to show?
Use Docker desktop, that's all.
Okay, no, let's just talk, let's have Carson, if you wouldn't mind. Let's just have Carson talk about, okay, so I know the context by which I'm saying, okay, Paul, I've made a decision. I want to have a local cluster. How am I going to do it? This is the how. These are some of the options. Now we're going to see Carson actually set up a local K3S cluster. And what does it mean to have that? Okay.
All right. Well, I'm gonna just, so I have a nice flat surface upon which to use my mouse. I'm just gonna do this instead of I hate tilted. I can't use the touchpad, and I hate podiums because they tilted my mouse slides down every time I like it. So I'm just gonna sit here. You can't hear me, let me know. All right. This is completely ad hoc, in case it feels a little.
It's real. Just say it's real.
There you go. So I think it's actually, we'll go to the K3S search. So I'm a big fan of K3S just because it's the fastest way.
Environment though too.
Oh, I am on Linux, but I'm going to use K3D. I'm a big fan of K3S, but I pretty much exclusively use it through K3D. So we'll cover both of those tools real quick. I think they do a really great job, honestly, of explaining the Kubernetes architecture and I think I was trying to get to with like contain, right? So there's the K3S server on the left, which you can see there's like each of these would be a separate process that you would have to run on a VM or somewhere if you were doing a full-fledged Kubernetes, right? You put Kubernetes on a cloud, you go run it, with any of the cloud providers. Somebody's running each of these as a separate thing that you're starting and configuring, and it's not like just, run a command. But the K3S process encompasses and grabs all of that and just says, yeah, well, you run K3S, and if we run all these things inside it, don't worry about it.
Would you say, Carson, this would be this is the main node?
Yeah. Yeah, and it's also, honestly, with local dev, you don't split out.
I know, but
the control plane runs on the
if
same.
you hear of a main node or a regular node, this is kind of what would be considered a main node.
Yep.
So in the olden days, we would say master, but we don't say that.
Yeah, we don't. I don't remember what the exact terminology is anymore. But they've got really great stuff. So to get K3S, it is because it's one binary. It's the whole thing. You literally can just download it and get it. And like I said, I'll go through that, and then I'll go through K3D, which is I actually use. So, okay, thank you.
And his password? No, sorry.
Actually, check the wrong one there.
I'm gonna use the same password, right? So.
Yeah,
You have to use my password or you can't install it. So definitely don't run random curls from the internet like I just did, except for when all the times we all actually do it all the time.
Meaning, don't do this.
All right. So what you should get, presumably at the end of that, is you should get K3S. I think I actually downloaded it separately, but you'll get that goes out and gets K3S and installs this binary. And it's actually really straightforward. Again, the thing from the diagram back here, the main thing I'm going to point out is that this container D part, that's why K3S on its own doesn't really work if you don't already have some sort of, if you're not on Linux, you don't have some container runtime already installed, right? So even without K3D, you kind of have to have a Docker. You don't have to, but you typically want Docker installed. So
I think for K3,
to do K3S,
it's not where it runs it.
yeah, for K3D you have.
K3S, you could manually start each of the processes if you wanted to, but don't want to.
Meaning right here.
To get started, you run K3S and you run the server. And I guess they want me to run it as root. I don't know, whatever. And I have
And
listening
most
on that.
likely there's a way of setting it up so you don't have to run it as root, right?
Probably is. And you know what? I'm just going to skip past this. Let me just jump back. You don't want to use K3S directly. Nobody wants to use K3S directly. I was going to pretend I was going to walk through it. Go get K3D. Like, get Docker installed and get K3D.
Well, and
If you saw, like, now it's setting up stuff. It's trying to listen on other ports. I don't have these problems when I just use K3D. It's actually much smoother.
when he said though, get Docker, you can get it on Linux. Of course, it's free. Just Docker.
Any Docker compatible.
Right,
Yeah.
but Docker compatible.
K3S, you can do the remote stuff too. So if you have your Docker host environment variable set, if it's running somewhere else, as long as you have the ability to do a Docker run command from your current context, you can use K3D. And it may mean that you're not actually running the Kubernetes server on your local system, just like you don't have to run Docker containers locally if you have a socket or a remote host that you're running them. So that's what's nice about it. Like if you've done a lot of development with Docker, K3D is just wrapping Kubernetes around that existing Docker host. It kind of,
And pretty much Rancher desktop or Docker desktop. We're gonna talk about that one, but Rancher, that's basically what it's doing, the same thing.
Well, I for what it's worth, I did get it working. What you would do at K3S is you would run it. It's going to then write out. It'll start the API server. It starts the whole process. It'll write out to a config file, and I can't. It's like var lib. It prints it out somewhere in here, and they're really good at their documentation on the website. Say where's this config file to talk to the API server that I just made. Again, I would get K3D. Which you don't even need K3S. That's, you can just go straight to K3D. You do not need
It
K3S.
contains.
It contains it. And once you get that, what you get is this much more useful, honestly, wrapper around creating Kubernetes clusters in Docker using K3S, right? So it's actually, and it does all the work to configure your kubectl config and basically make it really easy to work with. So you can do K3S cluster list and see if you have any clusters already. You can do cluster create, and there's good stuff on the docs, but I'll just skip through. I'm going to create cluster.
Yeah, it makes comment.
Okay.
What's interesting is in the olden days, you didn't have what would be called the cluster APIs. And so what Kubernetes did finally is created a set of APIs for cluster management.
This is all K3S's. K3D is just command structure, though.
Right. But I'm saying is that that's also, when you see these things, there are tools that can actually do these things that are talking to the cluster API.
One thing that you also should probably point out if you haven't already, the catch-up project, K3 sup.
Yep.
That helps you get K3S like super duper fast.
Okay.
And none of the headaches that you normally have to.
I've never seen that. Okay.
that one
Yeah.
will take AWS credentials. Like, isn't that designed to also be like, I'm not going to run this locally. I want to spin up a new K3S cluster on a set of VMs in AWS, or is it just a wrapper around?
I think you can do both. I used it to set up all of my nodes on my Raspberry Pi cluster.
So for the uninitiated, let's go to, again, you can see this is raw, unpracticed. If you said, Carson, here's a computer, I put something, Docker desktop, Rancher desktop, I put something on here that has access where you can type Docker PS and get a result, right? So Carson, I've given you a computer, you can type Docker PS and I have containers, but even though I didn't have containers, it doesn't give you an error saying I don't know what Docker is. So if you say, here's that computer, run a Kubernetes clusters now as fast as you can. What I would do is I would install K3D, again, running their script or however you want to get it. It's just like a single binary. Then I would use that command to create a cluster, which I just did. So I kind of did that ahead of time. And then what that actually did, and you can actually see it because I have you'll notice a while back, this started showing up. So when I created this cluster, I have an extension. I have a prompt extension so that when I have a kube config, it tells me what my kube config active is and what the namespace I'm in is.
So are people familiar with a context, right? Kube context. That's what he's referring to.
So
Michelle recognizes that context so that he's on all these clusters all the time and he needs to know what he's really
working against.
what he's working against.
So, but that's it.
Was that context, like, it knows that's the context it's in because you just created that cluster?
Correct. When you create a cluster, if I make a new cluster, if I do Utah K8s 2, it's going to spin up another Docker container, do a new cluster, and add that cluster's config to my active kube config.
Okay. It's the environment variable.
It will obey the environment variable.
Yeah,
Or
because if you leave yours, it's gonna, because you can have multiple in your config, and whichever one is pointed as the active through your environment variable, just like did that, or it goes out and searches via the kubelet config view.
There's so kubectl config
Like it's view.
right? So you get something like this. But you don't, it just says, it said, I made a cluster for you. I know how to do that. I'm going to go set up your config. Just type kubectl. So what I consider having access to a cluster is just, can I run kubectl, say cluster info, and get information back, right? If I can talk to Kubernetes API with the main thing we all talk to, and if once you've got a kube config, your editors are going to pick that up, and all your Kubernetes enabled features in your editor would just start working with this. All your Kubernetes API aware tooling, so kubectl or anything else you've basically written using standard SDKs, or anybody's written, will just pick up and now use your cluster. So now I have, let's see. So it comes, if you do just a very, very basic K3D cluster create, it creates a one node cluster.
Notice me, senpai.
What?
Notice me.
Yes, sorry.
Who are you?
Nobody important. It's worth noting for posterity that a Kubernetes context is a combination of a cluster
And
and,
user.
Well, and a
and
credential,
who you are to that
a
cluster.
username.
It's not
So like your user, your principal in the security space, but like just really like a user or like what privileges you have, etc., which could be different. You have several contexts for the same cluster, and that's why we call it a context. Because you actually want those separate, because Kubernetes, even at the most basic local level, has those constructs for you have access to this, but not this.
in the context of local. I'm usually just dealing with like, can I get to the cluster at all?
Yeah,
Right? So, like, I have admin
No,
on
that's
this.
a good
I have,
point, Greg.
but you're right. A context is a combination of all those things. In fact, it shows it here, right? A minimal context is
Yeah.
right. You say I'm in this context. That means it's this cluster as this user.
You just don't want to fall into the trap that I've seen people fall into of, oh, that's just what cluster I'm pointing to. No, it's also your credentials to that cluster.
Yeah, you're right. It's more than that. But you've got a whole bunch of stuff from there. You can actually haven't done a lot of this. You can scale up. I won't go through it because I honestly don't know the exact commands. You can create clusters with more than one node. You can create clusters with more or less infrastructure. What's interesting is if we get all of the pods from this newly created cluster, there's actually a lot that K3D, again, it created one Docker container, launched the Kubernetes K3S process in there to give me an access to an API, and also bootstraps kind of what you would want for like a bare bones local dev. Like there's enough in here that you can get local path volumes created. There's stuff in here so you can actually mess with Helm charts. I tend to turn most of this off, to be honest, because I want just an API. But
Yes, as well.
Yeah.
You can see the.
yeah, this is actually really cool. It's a good point. So there are 4 because there's the load balancer for each cluster and the actual server for each cluster. So all these actual other processes are nested inside. In fact, we can do that. Let's look at this. Docker exec IP. It's really neat to see. We go into server 0. Oh, do we not get bash?
I don't think,
So you can actually see this is more one-to-one with, each of these container shims is one of the containers inside one of my pods in Kubernetes. This is not stuff you really have to understand, but it's kind of neat to see that, again, you run K3D, give me a cluster, and suddenly you can interact with that cluster. You can create, it's already running containers, it's already running workloads and working like a full Kubernetes API. And yeah, that's the basics. It's 2 commands, and you're like, now kubectl works, and I can do all of the tutorials from the Kubernetes website. Not all, but you can do a overwhelming majority of like, oh, how do deployments work? How do cron jobs work? By just taking the YAML files from the Kubernetes docs and sending them to your machine. And when you're done, this is my favorite part, Mr. Delete, right? And everything goes away, right? Which I like. It's because you can bring it up, you can screw it up, you can throw a bunch of garbage at it, and then just delete it when you're done. Because it's really easy just to bring back a new one when you want to play with it again.
Really good for the like feature gate stuff. So now that alpha APIs aren't enabled by default, you have to actually tell the API server that you want to use a certain alpha feature And so spinning up a cluster, you can pass in additional arguments to the API server, one of which might be turn on this alpha feature gate. So if there's something coming down the pipe and you want to test it now, this is definitely one of the easiest ways to test it.
So what Greg is talking about for those that you do in the Kubernetes land, they have this notion of alpha, beta, stable. And so you'll have things introduced to the Kubernetes ecosystem that says, I'm going to do a new ingress type, or enhanced, I should say. Well, it'll be alpha in 1.20 blah. It'll be beta in 1.20 blah blah, and then it'll be stable in 1.3 blah. And that whole range is to whether I want how energetic and how on the edge do I want to be if I want to use an alpha feature within a production environment versus waiting till stable. And in the past,
Everyone would just use the alpha features.
I've used it all the way across the board, but there's no guarantee that something won't change significantly between alpha, beta, and stable. They typically don't. I haven't seen it.
With alpha to beta, there's actually usually some decent changes. And so that's why on alphas that used to just always be available, now most providers will turn them. You have to opt into alpha features of the control plane.
So
Alpha CRDs and stuff are different because CRDs you apply yourself.
Yeah.
But
also, not to get the full context, but one of the reasons I love K3D is you can throw it in your dev workflow, right? So this is a script that runs for one of our operators as part of I want to run this locally. And it actually says, assume you have nothing set up. So you can, there's a lot of stuff around this, but you can see the root commands here, like create the cluster, apply some baseline resources into the cluster, set up the configuration, and then run the service. And you can just do this, and then it's set up so that when you stop developing locally, it wipes the whole thing out, which is really, really nice for somebody saying, oh, I want to work on this thing that messes with the Kubernetes API. And we say, yeah, it's a few commands away, and you have a fresh API in this known state, and then we're done, we delete it.
Now we've talked about local development, but in conjunction with that, you have this notion of, well, how do I do a testing environment? Garden provides a little bit of a quicker, I don't know if it's quicker, but a way of bringing up a cluster in your CI/CD type world, if you will, and then tear it down. Again, that may be I'm developing, but I'm also wanting a test environment that's reproducible, right? And these are also some great tools that they can come up and they can come down, and I start pristine every time.
And I
should say.
I haven't used it, but I've also heard really good things about Kind, as far as Kind is more declarative. Kind is more, give me a directory full of YAML files and tell me to create a cluster based on the directory. K3D is more like what we call imperative, right? Like you have to create it from nothing, and you, like, we've built our own little infrastructure that creates the cluster and applies a known state. Whereas Kind, if I was going to build something for testing, I'd probably use Kind, even though I like K3D.
Okay, so this is where the nuance happens. Depends upon where your scale is and the context of what you're developing. If you're at the lower level, meaning I really know Kubernetes well, I'm developing at the Kubernetes API level, and or I'm at a certain environment, then the K3S is probably where you'd start.
You died.
Huh?
Died.
I died?
Sharing is.
Sharing died.
No. He was sharing earlier.
Oh, okay, his sharing died.
I didn't die yet, but thank you for the awareness of that.
Sorry.
Can I call home just quickly? No.
Maybe.
But the thing is that if you're not at that level, that context is not at that level, then you stop and say, okay, I want to understand Kubernetes, but I don't want to really understand Kubernetes, right? I want a Kubernetes environment. And I'm just doing nice development with my IDE or other things, and I just don't want to have to manage all this low-level stuff. That's where Kind would be a good place to start. Another one would be, I would contend, like the Rancher desktop. Rancher desktop is for a container environment. The reason I said it that way is because you can actually use the Docker D, or you can use the Moby. You can, but you can still run containers, okay? But one of the features of Rancher Desktop is also an ability to bring up Kubernetes environment. And in that regard, I think it's K3D at that point.
Yeah, I think it is.
It's actually worth noting in Rancher Desktop, you can't turn off the Kubernetes environment.
You can.
And now,
Oh, you can now.
Yeah, you can.
That's a recent development.
It's, you know,
Yeah, it was really annoying for.
6 months ago, that was not true.
no, that's absolutely true. That is true. All right, so let's, yeah, let me do this. I'm not going to continue on this one. Let me just stop presenting.
You should actually add case up to that. So
I
you
was
should-
going
you
to do
should
that.
never use K3S unless you're trying to build your own platform with Kubernetes embedded inside of it.
Okay.
Instead, you should use K3D if you want everything wrapped into
Docker.
Docker, or you should use KSUP, whose entire job is to basically create the SysMD services and all the stuff that you would need to have the processes running on wherever you tell it to run them. And it just automates that. So it's
K sub SU.
K3 sub, so it's K3S up.
pronounced ketchup according to their doc.
It is, that is correct. They tell you to pronounce it ketchup.
But it also lets you work as not only a master, but a client to the cluster.
So like the stuff that you're doing where you're just running K3S, if you didn't want to have to maintain the SysMD scripts and all the stuff that it
I read
takes.
kind actually. For similar reasons, like we're talking about the nuance of all the layers of where you're in, like, so like there's a difference between like you and the group that you work with. Like whether it's an open source, whether it's like a huge company or a small company or whatever you're gonna do, like if you're gonna try to provide like one workflow, I don't think that there's an answer for any of this. What you want to do is separate your concerns, but even that statement is, okay, but where are the lines drawn? And so I have standardized one way and other people might standardize another way. And so like I use kind because it's much more, I just need a cluster and I want to treat that as like an isolated component of the system. And I don't want to like illustrate like low level details of it or anything like that. I want, give me a cluster. We'll treat it like any Kubernetes cluster and we will not treat it like it's a special snowflake at all. And we'll blow it away and recreate it all day long. And then for things like, I want to spin up all the things inside it, you can do that with kind and we don't. We just do it with like, well, we being different people for different groups, but like Scaffold is a scenario. Helm is a scenario. There are lots of tools to say like, I want to run these services in a cluster and it doesn't matter whether it's local or not. You just say, this is where I want to run it. And then you get that magic.
And the things that he talked about were deployment tools, the way of deploying applications into clusters, not the actual cluster.
Yeah.
Itself.
How you glue up the pieces. That's just very cloud native thinking as opposed to Kubernetes centric thinking.
Okay. So let's just back up just a little bit. There's some context of when you'd use it. I mean, you have a local cluster. You may just want to just run a Docker run or Docker compose if you wanted to. Or we've kind of gone to that, you know, that whole spectrum of saying, okay, now I have a local environment. Then it comes down to, well, which one of these do I want to do? Again, it's the context within the Kubernetes world, what level I'm working at. And then what Todd's just talking about is I'm just a service developer. I just develop services. And I just want to deploy this thing into an environment that I know is going to be a similar environment into my production world. And that's where the kind, the tilt, garden maybe, those kind of are those worlds that you'd stay in. Again, you do have to have a cluster, right? And we've talked about the easiest one probably are these higher level ones like Rancher Desktop, kind, you know, those type of things. But now we're at this level saying, okay, I've got a local cluster. I've got it running. I don't need to manage it too much other than I can now just deploy things in. What I'm going to do now is just show you, okay, this right here is Rancher Desktop. This is
by Tuesday? What?
Yes, they did a while back.
Oh, wow. Okay.
This is where you can turn on and off Kubernetes. Okay. Which I do when I'm not hearing about it. And what's nice again about this environment is if I'm really at that lower level-ish kind of context, I can choose versions and I can bring them up and down and those type of things if I care.
You do that all with K3S or K3D and kind of, I'm sure, but the UI here is really.
Yeah, this is really, and this UI is Linux, Mac.
And it's one, it's also, we're saying it's one cluster,
I
right?
think Windows does, but we don't talk Windows here. Yeah, but it's one cluster. And so, well, no, I mean, we're talking Kubernetes, you know, it's,
DSL.
I know. So then let's talk about, let's see, what else would I want to use? Well, in this case, I have gone to Tilt, okay? And in that case, I'm saying, okay, well, I'm just a developer. I have a back end, I have a front end, and I'm just developing. I want to do a rapid development, iterative development world. And I want to be in a cluster, okay? And that's where I would go to, let's see here. Did I go there too much? No, sorry. Too much other stuff here. This is one. I'm not advocating this is the better one versus another one, but this is A1, and I've actually used it and I've liked it in the past. This is that kind of thing of I'm a developer. I'm not an admin of a cluster. I'm just a developer. But I want to make sure I have this environment that is similar, as I said. And so you can go and download it. It's open source. It just happened to be purchased by Docker, I think. So who knows?
Self-purchase Docker? I mean, the other way
Who
around.
knows? And for all those Docker people, I'm sorry, but who knows?
It reminds me of if you were trying to build a Docker Compose style thing that was based around Kubernetes instead of Docker, this is probably what you would.
And I think that's probably what Docker's thinking about. Okay, maybe I didn't win on the swarm world, although Europe still has a lot of swarm. But you know, I need to do something in the Kubernetes land, and I like this environment.
It lets you lean in on like operators and things there too. So not only does it do like an individual developer can use it if they want tooling to have like I think they call it tilt file, I don't remember, but like
They do, and I'll show you that
yeah.
very quickly.
And then if you want to instead have a platform engineering team that builds a more comprehensive integration environment around it, it has hooks in that file
Keep on
that
growing it.
lets you do more and more things in Kubernetes native ways, which is just
So thank you, Greg. I think there's some good context at the level of when you're going to use certain things in this case. So Tilt is okay, and all I did was I downloaded it. As I say, it downloads very easily for Mac. Downloads and installs really easily on Linux.
It's Go-based probably, right? So it's yet another, here's a big binary that's your program.
Bingo.
Yeah, it's well, of course.
We're in the golden age of just download the binary. It's pretty great.
The other thing is what we were just talking about. Let me see if I can grab that. Come up with me. I just downloaded a demo or tutorial environment that's called Tilt-Avatars. It's a Python app, and there's some other things, but it has a database, I think, and it just is an environment where you can say, okay, this is kind of like what I do my normal development. It kind of looks like my normal development world. And so what we were talking about earlier, or Greg was just talking about, is a tilt file. Is very much like many of these other systems out here. It describes certain things of your environment. And in fact, in this one, what's interesting is because you want this rapid turnaround, right? So like in the Node.js world, there's that quick reload, right? It's just make a change, boom, I get to see it. This provides that similar environment in an image world. Okay, and so what they're doing actually is they're kind of doing some fun things and replacing certain layers, if you will, of the image. It's not kind of, but you know, we'll show. It's really fast, but it shows kind of how you're building it, what are the requirements of it, And, you know, this is basically saying, build the thing in here and then create this image and then make sure it runs. Just kind of edits on the fly in the cluster. And so what I did was I just said, in this world, there's a command like, well, if I do tilt, there are a bunch of things here you can look at. I just did a tilt up, and it takes as a default the tilt file, and then brings up this environment. So if I did everyone has these shortcuts, right? These aliases in our world. This is actually a go get pod from all namespaces. Okay. This shows what I'm running in that world. Okay. Here's the web thing, meaning I'm in this default namespace. So these are my apps that were deployed, my APIs and my web, front end and back end. Okay.
Just do K3D under, like that's like a suspiciously similar
Yeah.
like set of pods from the K3D.
Yes, yeah, but I think it is running, you know, well, it is running K3D because I'm running Rancher.
Okay, you're right. Okay, that makes sense.
But what it did is it brought up an environment that basically has this website. Okay. Python for the API and some front end stuff. I'm a back end guy. So some front end stuff, right? And so what's nice about this, again, is I'm just a developer in my system. I wanted to do stuff in a very iterative way. In this case, I just happen to know that since it's a Python app, right, I'm just doing some stuff on the back end that I want to be able to see if it quickly, iteratively shows up on the front end without a redeploy and waiting for things to happen. So in this case, I'm just going to remove. So if you looked again at this website, beautifully done. I mean, this looks like it was done from a back end perspective. No, you know, it's just this interesting thing of, you know, eyebrows, blah, blah, blah. Great. You know, this is cool. Really sweet. Okay. So here's an app, and I just want to change something that allows you now to have another function or feature on that site. So right here, I'm going to just do, I just happen to know, I remove this. I do a save. And in this case, I'm not doing a quick reload, meaning I did a manual reload, and this other instantaneously showed up. Okay. So what did it do actually? Well, because of that tilt file, it knew the components of the system that I'm developing in. It knew how to do what it needed to create a new running pod with the changes that I've just made and have it be put into the cluster, and you're live. So this is what is a nice environment that I'm in Kubernetes. Did I know I'm in Kubernetes? Well, I did it first, but I can almost like say, I don't even know what I'm doing anymore. Okay. I'm just a developer, and I can then just do this repetitive, iterative development environment. Please.
So maybe I got a little lost. You're using Rancher Desktop. Tilt's not like a Rancher Desktop. It is just a live reloading.
Okay, let's back up, and I apologize. We talked about how we would get a local Kubernetes cluster up. We talked about K3S, K3D. We talked about then, if you don't want to do it at that level, there are things that have wrapped it in a nice environment. Rancher Desktop, Docker Desktop, Hind does it a little bit too. It's a little different, but it's this higher level that says, okay, you want a cluster, here it is. And if you want some tools to administrate it at a GUI level, here it is. So that was what the Rancher world was. So I have a cluster.
The development though, right? That's just like
That's the runtime environment. That's my cluster. Then we said, wait a second, I'm in a different context. I want to be in a cluster, meaning I want my application to deploy in a cluster because in production it's clustered. You know, how it deploys. I have a great DevX team that has tools, and I want to deploy it using those tools, and I can do that now. I can just do it in my local cluster. And then I said, well, you could use things like Kind doesn't tilt that says, okay, I'll make it so that now, yes, whatever technology you use to create the cluster, fine. You're just going to cluster up. That's all I care about. Now I'll give you an environment whereby I can watch things, I can do things, I can redeploy things on the fly. So I'm in this repetitive, iterative, REPL environment. Did that clear that up?
Yeah,
Somebody said it before and it's,
Context, basically.
Yeah, that's all it's doing. It's looking at the environment variable and it just goes.
Is there a reason why you would choose to use tilt instead of like running a development build of your?
No, it does have some things in it that does this. I don't know if it's using Buddha or Builda or whatever underneath.
think about what just happened, right? So for like, so
Yeah.
this is forwarding to a pod in the cluster that's running a built container. Like, so to do that, you'd have to have your own pipeline of Docker build, upload that somewhere where you
A registry.
I see.
So this is like it's building it, injecting it, restarting the deployment, like restarting your pod port forward, because when the pod goes away, your port forward doesn't auto reconnect. Like it actually just did like 20 things for you.
So it's like a magic layer for the
Yes.
developer that doesn't know about
Magic.
Kubernetes.
It's like Docker Compose. I've never seen it before, but to me, I think the analogy is perfect. It's like Docker Compose, but it's using Kubernetes under the hood.
Yeah, when I saw the original, how many years ago they had a demo on this at GopherCon?
Oh, wow.
Like in 2020. And yeah, like the whole point of it was basically saying it's to encourage not necessarily development in the cloud, but like to get the developer feedback loop quicker, right? Like you no longer have to go through the whole CI/CD for feedback. You've built it, put it in the cloud, test it. There's your feedback loop's basically gone from however many minutes to seconds. And so it's not necessarily saying this is how we deploy to production, but you have your dev environment and you're literally in developing locally and then,
Yeah.
running it against dev
So-
instantaneously.
Like, for example, if I was working on like a Go service and I'm like using Air, the library loader.
It's a similar world.
But like it abstracts that to multiple languages. That's
Okay.
a good way to think about it. You can definitely do the same thing for individual tool chains. This is trying to say like, we'll
For every-
unify that and we'll build even more.
It'll handle
tooling.
rebuilding.
It's a more hands-off, kind of does a lot of things. The
Sure.
magic.
It's just, you're doing it at a different layer.
And with a, descriptive manner with like the tilt file where you can check it into the repo. Anybody that has tilt and has access to a Kubernetes server, either locally or just in their environment, however you configured it, can then run it. Because it works that locally and in integration environments, it works really, really well in integration environments. So you're trying to be like, okay, now here's where a bunch of teams are going to do things. And our CI/CD system also understands how tilt works and can kind of hook into the same thing and set up the ephemeral branch build style stuff.
It also has like a really cool UI that's completely customizable by your tilt file. Like you want to add a button that is like send to my CI for testing. You can have a button that does that. You can script a command in there that does it.
It's one of the farthest along Kubernetes platform engineering tool chain style tools that I've seen.
Yeah.
And now that Docker's behind it, it's got resources to hopefully maintain and it won't be.
It's a great, the glue of all these things is so seamless with tilt versus all the other things you'd have to do in order to get that same type of.
When people talk about like backstage is a completely different view of how you would try to do this kind of stuff. When you're talking about a developer on a machine in a control loop, writing code, testing it, then moving to an integration environment, testing it there, potentially prod. I don't think this is really designed to try to go to that next step of prod. Maybe eventually they'll add in more features that do that. But this solves those problems where it's like backstage is where it's like, I need that cluster in this project to do this stuff, and I'm going to connect it to these other services. This is much more on your machine, your day-to-day activities than something like that.
This is where I'm just a developer. Really. And I'm a developer of Python, or I'm a front-end developer, which I'm not. But, and I want an environment, but I still want it in Kubernetes, because that's really where my life will be when I actually do the full production deployment. All right, any questions? Because I think we've actually gone through quite a few things. Any questions before? I think we can end it, but Q&A, whatever you need. Todd, please.
I think it's important to note that this is why this is the actual joy of the Kubernetes ecosystem. Like, we're talking about a lot of things that are essentially different pieces of the stack that you can glue up differently because they are just Lego bricks. And that's fairly new in the world of development. You can hand people a section of the stack that enables them to work on the piece that they care about without having to understand all the rest. And also you can hand that to them with them being able to like peek under the hood and be like, how does this work? And kind of go into the next layer, pull up beyond or whatever. So it's not like you don't need to advocate for one tool or the other. And that's why we've talked about a whole bunch. Like tilt isn't the answer.
No,
It's one of
it's
six.
an answer.
And it will cover like certain Lego bricks, and other pieces will cover like half of those Lego bricks and a half dozen others. Like you can combine these however works for you and your cohort or whatever you want to call it. That's the power that we're actually talking about here. It's not the tool, it's the ecosystem.
Thank you for bringing it up, because I think for those who've been around the world in Kubernetes land, I mean, when I first started, and many of us, it was really hard.
It was a process.
It was really hard, especially because there really wasn't the cloud world. You had VMs, or actually bare metal. That's what we.
Yeah, Minikube originally was the install process was now get your VM system going.
It's just, and then you had to understand all these different things. The one thing I'm just going to say about this, and thank you, Todd, for bringing it up, is this is where Google shows how good they really are.
I would say that the best innovations were actually like the K3S, the ranchers.
No,
that took all of the like complexity that Google can never escape. And be like, actually, we can make this one process. And actually, we
We
can.
don't have to maintain your promises.
How they did kinds, types, selectors, how they did the API, how they modeled it was such, because now maybe they don't do it on their own, but they provided a foundation and an ecosystem whereby I can have these tools that build upon it. And that's why I think that's why Kubernetes has taken off versus Meso or Swarm or any of these others, even though they have different contexts, but Kubernetes has actually gone up to the Meso level, in my opinion, has gone definitely past the Swarm level.
Does anybody use Mesos anymore?
Well, yeah, I think NASA, does NASA?
100,000 container clusters.
Yeah. They're out there. But the key is, that's the beauty of Kubernetes, but also the beauty that we just showed is you can come at it at any level. Don't be afraid of Kubernetes if you don't understand Kubernetes at the intimate level, okay? You just need to know, I've got some great tools, bunch of them that I can choose from. I can have a local cluster, I can spin it up. And if I want to get a little bit higher, I've got some other tools that can put some glue together and make it really, that I don't even know I'm in Kubernetes land. I'm just a Python developer. I'm a front-end developer.
And you got people that will help you get there.
And yes, so. All right, I think that's enough. Thank you for everybody. Thank you, Thompson. And for those that haven't joined Forge, please join Forge.
Utah.tech.
Forge.utah.tech. We have many channels in there, one of which is Kubernetes. This is, as I constantly say, network has never been fiber or copper. It's us. And we're there to help. We're there to learn from each other, to grow from each other. Just use the Kubernetes community and others if you have questions. There's no dumb question, okay? Because we've all been there. So anyways, thank you for coming tonight. Yay. All right. Let me stop the recording and move on. Thank you for those who've been online.
For like probably a good 6 months, and then I became the only developer. Just tell it right in production.
Thank you for coming.
It's done.
Sorry about the door.
Have my
When you see me,
The secret here
financial records.
is that all local development. So.
What's that?
The overwhelming majority of our stuff does not. And you port forwards. So. Developers, come on, like our whole development org, like all their local devs just and number of port forwards through the API.
So you just have like a header.
Yeah, something like that when they do need to like run something.